Hello and welcome to Direct Initiative, the podcast where we talk about direct democracy and the importance of ballot measures. I'm Alex Kawa, and today we're going to be talking about some efforts that are ongoing in the states of Ohio and Arizona regarding certain issues that our voters are trying to get put onto the ballot for 2024. So in Ohio, this is just coming off the heels of the defeat of Issue 1 last week, which would have raised the threshold to pass a constitutional amendment from a simple majority to 60%. This is to pass a constitutional amendment at the ballot box, and voters overwhelmingly rejected it by a solid 14 points, which for a red state like Ohio is pretty good. And this was in direct response to organizers getting an initiative on the ballot for 2023, this November, that would codify the right to an abortion statewide in the Constitution. And now that Issue 1 has gone down, the abortion amendment is almost certain to pass because polls consistently show a pretty solid lead for it, considerably above 50%, just not quite into 60%, which is why Republicans in the Ohio State Legislature wanted to pass Issue 1, but they failed. So now abortion is probably going to be the law of the land in Ohio pretty soon. But now that this Issue 1 amendment has failed, this means that direct democracy and the initiative are here to stay in Ohio, and voters are now getting ready to take their next shot at the state legislature for their blatant, undemocratic power grab by taking away their redistricting power. Because the way it works in Ohio right now, redistricting is controlled by a 7-member panel, and it includes 2 state legislatures who are Republicans, 2 state legislators who are Democrats, as well as the governor, secretary of state, and state auditor. And because it's Ohio, they're all Republicans, and, well, I don't need to tell you how that ends up, but it's actually a lot worse than you might think. Quote, "The nonpartisan coalition, Citizens Not Politicians, has collected more than the 1,000 signatures they need to start the process of putting a constitutional amendment on the November 2024 ballot. In fact, just in a weekend, the group collected 7,300 from 31 different counties, according to spokesperson Chris Davey. In 2021 and 2022, the Ohio Redistricting Commission ignored 7 different bipartisan Ohio Supreme Court rulings against state house and congressional map proposals, eventually running out the clock to appoint a split federal court ordered maps that had been declared unconstitutional to be used for the November 2022 election." So this is gerrymandering unlike, honestly, I've ever seen before, but this is perfectly legal in a state like Ohio, where politicians draw their own districts, which it's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, we are supposed to be a democracy. A constitutional republic. But still, that would involve us electing our representatives, and then the representatives gets to pick who elects them, basically. And this is something that has been used for a long time. This is nothing new. Both parties do this. But this is actually an effort where if this gets on the ballot, it's passing 100%. There is no way. Voters are just not okay with gerrymandering, regardless of their party, because it affects both parties. Now, in a red state like Ohio, it obviously affects Democrats more, but in like California or New York or Illinois or my home state of Connecticut, for instance, that would obviously affect Republicans more since Democrats are the majority party here. And just to give further context as to why state legislatures can't be trusted to draw their own district lines, we go to the state of Alabama, which, if you recall, earlier this summer, around the first or second week of June, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a pretty surprising ruling to many people, including myself, said that the state had unfairly deprived black voters of a 2nd congressional district where they are the majority voting bloc. So Alabama has 7 congressional districts, and since blacks make up roughly a quarter of the population, then the Supreme Court ruled you need 2 districts that are black majority to ensure fair representation, and right now it's only 1. And this was crazy to think about because this is a completely, as we've discussed before, the Supreme Court is absolutely super far right and has made decisions that completely destroy their legitimacy. They're mired in corruption scandals, but even then, they got it right on this. And as we can imagine, the Alabama state legislature, the Republicans in the legislature, they said, you know what? Let's do right by the Supreme Court because we were always talking about how much the left is undermining the Supreme Court. So let's really show that they have the final say on this. And of course, I don't need to tell you that actually didn't happen. What actually happened was this. Quote, "Republicans made clear that they wanted to protect their 6 incumbents from a potentially ugly primary in a new district and created a map that kept certain counties and geographic areas together. Their plan increased the share of black voters in one of the state's 6 majority white congressional districts to about 40% and reduced the percentage of black voters in the one district held by Democrats to 51% from about 55%. Democrats were largely cut out of the process and opposed the final map. So this is just them blatantly defying the order of the Supreme Court, and this past Monday, August 14th, there was a panel of judges that held a hearing to determine, okay, is this constitutional? And very, very unlikely that this will stand because it's less than 40%. It's not even close to a majority. So yeah, this is probably going to get thrown out, but it shouldn't even be at this point. Black voters in Alabama shouldn't be shut out of representation. And this is why you can't put the redistricting power in the hands of the state legislature, because they're going to gerrymander to protect themselves, whether it be through partisan gerrymandering like they're doing in Ohio, or racial gerrymandering like they're doing in Alabama, which kind of ties into partisan gerrymandering since everybody knows that black voters overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. So they know that if they give black voters another majority district, that district is almost certain to go blue. But it's great to see Ohioans standing up to the unchecked power of the state legislature, from them trying to give themselves power over the voters, even more power over the voters through issue 1 and soundly rejecting that, and now standing up to take away their power to draw their own districts and lock themselves into these seats for decades to come potentially. It's great to see them pushing back against that and shows why direct democracy is necessary, as well as the recent push for abortion rights in Arizona, because Arizona advocates are now trying to get an initiative onto the ballot in 2024 as well that would codify the right to abortion in the state constitution. Now, this, of course, is nothing new. Of course, this is something that Ohio is likely to do this November, and the states of California, Michigan, and Vermont all did it in 2022 on the ballot. Quote, Arizona currently bans abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, with limited exceptions. Abortion opponents have asked the Arizona Supreme Court to allow enforcement of a law dating to the Civil War that bans virtually all abortions. The proposed constitutional amendment would guarantee abortion rights until a fetus could survive outside the womb, typically around 24 weeks of pregnancy. It would also allow later abortions to save the mother's life or to protect her physical or mental health. And that's really important because that is exactly what Roe v. Wade was. Roe v. Wade was people on the right like to paint it as this crazy far-left radical activist decision when in reality it was quite moderate. It specifically said that, in the first trimester, it is 100% the woman's right. But in the third trimester, if states so choose, because at this point the baby can theoretically survive outside the womb, or the fetus rather, states can restrict that if so they choose. The second trimester, it's kind of a mix between those two things, but by and large it would have been the woman's right. But that was when Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. Obviously it's not now. And Republicans really screwed themselves over. And there was this one tweet, or I refuse to call them posts now, as they're now called, on the site formerly known as Twitter, that I will continue to refer to as Twitter because I'm not going to go along with Elon's bullcrap. But regardless, there was this tweet that I saw after issue 1 failed in Ohio that summed up the situation perfectly. Can't overstate it. Roe v. Wade was an electoral gift to Republicans while it was alive. It turned an issue that's a huge loser for the party into a winner. They could mobilize their anti-abortion base without triggering a backlash by the abortion rights majority. Now, that's over. And that's exactly right. Abortion is what stopped the GOP from really getting a red wave in 2022. I mean, they still took the House, but just by the skin of their teeth, it was by less than 10 seats that they picked up. It really should have been so much more than that. And they lost several governorships that they should have won. They lost several Senate races that they should have won, especially with a pretty unpopular Democratic president. And it's going to keep screwing them over. And these abortion rights advocates that I mentioned, not abortion rights, anti-abortion advocates who are trying to get the Civil War era law reinstated in Arizona. Because, as we all know, there have been no major medical advances that might have changed the context of things between the 1860s and 2023. As we all know, medical information we have back then, it's all we have right now. It's the exact same, because as we all know, that's exactly the case. They're only going to make this worse for the Republicans because they're going to force them to go even further to the right on an issue that they have gone off the deep end on, and the majority of Americans are just not on board with, and it is killing them in slow motion. Actually, not even in slow motion, in rapid speed. But I wanted to cover these stories not just to give people an update on how people are utilizing the initiative process to do good things, not just in my opinion, but in the opinion of the majority of Americans, but also because of how ballot measures really can save democracy, not just because they would institute direct democracy, but I mean in the sense of actually preserving the current democratic institutions and the rule of law we currently have, because in Ohio, they're trying to stop the politicians from rigging elections because, the GOP goes on and on about how the 2020 election was rigged and it's rigged unless we win it. Well, this is an example of elections actually being rigged because they are drawing district lines to favor them, and that's not election rigging. Nothing is. And in Arizona, they're trying to win back a right that was the law of the land for 5 decades, and it's only because of an activist Supreme Court that we have right now that it was overturned. And so this is why direct democracy is important, because people think, oh, it infringes on minority rights and it makes the country less safe overall. Well, in these instances, it absolutely does not do that, because it gives people more political rights, more civil liberties, because the voters take into their own hands stuff that the legislature refuses to do that should already be off the table in a civilized society. So this is great news. I'm very happy to see activists in Ohio and Arizona pushing these things. And obviously, I hope everybody would join me in supporting them and getting these efforts on the ballot. And I'm sure we'll be covering more of these as more updates come out. But for now, thank you all very much for listening. If you enjoyed, then if you're listening on YouTube, please leave a like and subscribe to the podcast below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure you follow and leave a good review. And I will see everybody soon. I'm Alex Kawa, and this is Direct Initiative.